responsibility that they exert. And by the way, that's just not exerted in Western Europe and in the United States. It's very much the received wisdom in terms of the wealth funds of countries like China that nominally are communist. So, it has become a new dialectic in the modern world, and it's something that we have to listen and learn about. People often say, what if it had been Lehman's sisters rather than Lehman's brothers? Would we have had the same financial collapse? Women in finance are more cautious. They're looking more at the bottom line. They're looking more at the pennies rather than the gazillions. We've become so used to talking about billions and trillions. I think perhaps there would be a different dynamic. There would be a more holistic view that countries are not just economies, that they're societies as well. And I think Michael D. yesterday, in his very fine address on his inauguration, talked about transforming, and really in many ways transforming the debate. To actually achieve that in terms of the debate, I would say it's going to be really important, not just in this country, but right around Europe, for women to be part of that debate. We do have to reform welfare. We do have to reform the whole structure of work, because if, for instance, you want people who have responsibilities in relation to children to go to work, well then equally the public sphere has a responsibility to provide or to make available appropriate childcare, after-school care, and so on. All the stuff that so many of us have spent many, many decades talking about. But I think that what has been built up in terms of the European Union and the kind of social democratic, Christian democratic way of life, I think that way of life has been very important and very liberating for a lot of people, where they've been able to be economic participants and where they've been able to gain work and to become financially independent. And I think that's a core debate that we have to have. How do we provide people with economic independence and with an opportunity to work, particularly, as I say, during those active periods of their life? If we want a welfare state that's going to continue for the rest of the 21st century, we have to find a way of contributing and ensuring that people at work contribute, so that people who need appropriate support from social welfare at different stages of their life, that particularly during their working life, that social welfare is like a trampoline. It's a cushion, it's a support, but it's a cushion and a support that lifts you up and helps you to get to the goals that you want. So we're looking at reforming a number of areas. For instance, some of the direct payments that are made in terms of going back to school and so on, why shouldn't they really, in a way, go in the name of the child into the school for a national school book scheme and a lending scheme? We can do the same in relation to school uniforms and parents' committees. There's a lot of areas where we can do reform, which would mean that we would end up with an awful lot better value for money. A lot of South American countries have done a huge amount of reform in this area, where, for instance, cash payments are conditional on parents, on the children actually being in school, and they're directed into the activities that the children are doing. So I think we have a lot of thinking to do. Hopefully, this crisis will resolve itself. But I think we have to think in the context of the crisis how the financial markets have changed, what that means for us, and then what kind of a society do we want. And again, I just want to congratulate everybody who's been involved in Labour Women, and to say sisters can do it for themselves, and enjoy it.
I'm sure you understand that being the day after the day that was yesterday, I would like, as indeed a very late comer to politics myself, I have the most enormous respect for those many women who have worked on behalf of women and on behalf of the Labour Party over many, many years. Councillor Mary Freehill is one of those women. She has in fact been a Labour councillor on Dublin City Council since 1977, and so I'm delighted to ask Mary to come and share some of her experiences of 40 years with Labour as a woman in the Labour Party and on behalf of Labour. Of course, she herself has I suppose, Mary, I don't think there's anything you haven't actually touched on in your extensive and very dedicated career. Family law reform, contraception action programme, chairperson of the Rathmines, Ranelagh and Harold's Cross Drugs Awareness Group, and I know you're very dedicated to community activity and the need for community activity. So please welcome Mary.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Sisters, I certainly am delighted to have been asked to come here this afternoon to speak. And I must say, when I was thinking about the 70s, I even was amazed when I came up with a long list of discriminations against women in that reactionary Catholic Ireland that we lived in the 1970s. And it's great to see that we have come a long way, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done. So it's very much congratulations to all of the women who worked diligently together to make such a change. But the battle for reform never comes easy, and it's always as a result of hard work. So I was absolutely amazed when a friend of mine, around the same age as myself, a few years ago, decided as a mature student she would go to Trinity to do the BBS. So she told me one day, taking her what she was told in Trinity and at her lectures very, very seriously. She said, you know, we had a very interesting lecture the other day, and they were telling us that all the changes came about as a result of the women journalists in Ireland, and that they really changed all of this. Now, yes, the women journalists in Ireland did play an important role, and there's no doubt about that. But it's very interesting when, you know, the way history gets written and the kind of beliefs that somehow people have about how these things work. And certainly it was as a result of the long, dedicated, slow and certainly not glamorous efforts on the part of ordinary, committed women who were very tenacious that made such a difference in Irish society. So collectively, I would like to salute each and every one of you here in this room, because I know everybody here played a part in one way or another. So to go back to the 70s, when the Labour Women's National Council was formed, of which I was the founding secretary, that didn't come by accident either, or did it come easy? It came as a result of the Labour Women's Advisory Group. And there's one woman in this room who played an enormous part in setting that up and making that happen, and that is Alice O'Sullivan, who's sitting quietly there. Alice, please stand up. Alice O'Sullivan, along with Maisie McConnell, Anne O'Cleary and Evelyn Owens, established the Women's Advisory, and Alice, as a professional medical social worker, knew only too well the status and the situation for many women in Ireland, and she certainly played her part in changing things for Irish women. So when the Women's Council was formed, the situation was that for women back in the 70s, women had unequal pay. They had to resign from their job in the civil service and a lot of the public services on marriage. They had no ownership rights of the family home. Married women had unequal social welfare rights. Women couldn't sit on juries, so a woman could not be tried by her peers or by women. Many girls' secondary schools had very limited subject range, so therefore that in itself discriminated against women being able to go on to study in various areas. The same applied to many training courses and apprenticeships that were absolutely closed to women. And of course, there was no contraception apart from the family planning clinics that were voluntary, but otherwise it was illegal, and there was no divorce. Wives were battered and beaten up, had absolutely no place to go, and it wasn't even talked about. Mixed marriages couldn't adopt a child. And indeed, I remember Alice O'Sullivan telling me about the battle she had to get her name in the telephone directory. They were the days of the Mrs. Dawn Smiths, and we have come a very long way. And I remember the by-election in Ballyfermot in 1976, and we'd go to the pub after canvassing. So we were kind of beginning to take a drink at that stage, and we thought, why not get a pint because it's cheaper than 2 half pints? So they said, no. They absolutely refused us a pint, that they wouldn't, that the woman could not be given a pint. So we even had to pay more for our drink as well. So having gone through that list, I have to ask, we were living in a very totalitarian, Catholic-ridden society, because the conservatism of attitudes to women were certainly defined by the authority of the Catholic Church. There's no doubt about that. The influence of the Church, really, in terms of because they ran education and they ran the health services, so they had a huge amount of control and certainly weren't about to give it up. So in some ways, I'm sure you can understand why men were so reluctant to give way also, because they had the power and they genuinely believed that they could do things better. So the battle within the party to open doors and to speak at conferences certainly was absolutely huge as well. The first breakthrough came really when Niamh Bhreathnach became chair of the party. And I really have to acknowledge that, and Niamh certainly helped everybody and helped to open doors. It was great to have Niamh there, and it made a huge difference. But I also want to acknowledge Dick Spring, because really I think he was probably the first leader who seemed to have a much more enlightened attitude towards women. And I'm sure coming from having a very strong and formidable mother in Ma Spring, I have no doubt made a huge difference to Dick's attitudes. So when the Labour Women's National Council was formed in 1974, the first action we took was to form a number of subcommittees on a very wide range of subjects to prepare a policy document for the 1975 annual conference. So we had working groups in education, on employment and training, facilities for mothers, pensions, social welfare, income tax, health, community care and family law. Our first real battle came at the end of 1974 in relation to equal pay. We had joined the EEC at that stage, and in fact I have to say the EEC was one of our biggest allies. They were obliged, because we were members of the European Union, the Irish government was obliged to implement equal pay. So I remember the Labour was in power at that time, and we were met by Michael O'Leary, Barry Desmond and Conor Cruz O'Brien, who were all ministers at the time. And I remember at one of the meetings anyway, where Michael O'Leary was really kind of saying, women, please, please back off. And he was sitting on a desk in front of us, and he was really trying to get us to kind of realise what, the damage it would do to Irish economy if we insisted on equal pay. And he said, do you realise it will close down the sweet and biscuit industry? It will close down the boot and shoe industry. And we will put an unbearable burden on the cost of delivery of public services. And what amused me most of all was, as he was sitting dangling his feet, he was wearing these wonderful pair of Italian shoes. So he wasn't exactly looking after the Irish boot and shoe industry himself. So I kind of thought it was quite a contradiction. I remember that Christmas, as the Secretary of the Council, spending the entire Christmas telephoning every Labour woman that I could find in the country. And we had a meeting, I remember, in January. And I mean, the women now really did come in their droves. And we really... it was the first time as women in the party that we had to stand up to the party. And I think that was kind of a big turning point. And we began to get a sense of our own power at that stage. And of course, they didn't succeed in putting the derogation. And that was the first piece of legislation. That was followed then by the legislation on the Family Home Protection Act, maintenance of children and spouses, attachment of earnings, which I remember Alice worked so hard and pushed and was aware of that. That was very radical. The attachment of earnings was in a separation situation where the wife had a right to claim part of her husband's wages from the employer. And up to that, and then of course joint family home ownership and joint tenancies. I remember proposing at the 74 conference, and I was just thinking when Joan talked about citizens' advice bureaus today, that we would need a citizens' advice bureaus in Ireland, where there would be people who would be sensitive to explain and be objective and so forth, and that we also would need creches. And in fact, I think it's important to say that Frank Kluski established the citizens' advice bureaus in Ireland, and there was the Labour Party who were saying that people should not have to depend on their elected representatives to know what their rights are. And that was kind of, there again, a very radical thing to do at that time. So all these changes, they came slowly, but I suppose really when you look at them on paper, we achieved a considerable amount. And apart from being Secretary of the Labour's National Council, I was also involved in the setting up of Contraception Action Programme, which we called CAP. And I suppose really to go into the great details of that is really a talk for another day. But I have to tell you that the battle to legalise contraception in Ireland was absolutely huge. And it was a very bitter and a very, very long battle. And it was hugely opposed by the Catholic Church and by the church laity at the time. I remember we used to... Those days we'd hand out literature outside churches. And I remember being in Ballyfermot, outside Ballyfermot Church, and Father Cleary coming out and being extremely, he was very diminishing. And I remember he says, what are you going on about that kind of thing at all? Church, not asking people to wear socks in bed. Ho, ho, ho. And off he went. And of course we now know Father Cleary and what his life. So, it was, but anyway, we had our fun as well. And I remember the thing about the not being offered, being able to buy a pint was something that annoyed us. And I remember some of the women, this was it might have been Irish Women United now that I would have been on the fringes of. And we talked about the idea of a New Year's Eve that we would go around the pubs and that we would order 12 hot whiskies. And when the hot whiskies was put up on the counter, that we would say, we'd now like a pint as well, please. But we never actually got around to it, but it was a great idea anyway. And I remember even on the contraception thing as well, we had, I remember somebody coming up with the idea of blowing up condoms and tying them to the railings of Leinster House, but we never actually, I think Brian Trench was somebody we would kind of test ideas out with, and Brian thought, no, it wasn't a good idea, so that went by the wayside. But anyway, I must say that I'm very honoured to be the first Secretary of the Labour National Council, as well as having an opportunity to play my part in the beginnings of the campaign for equality in Ireland. And I would very much like to acknowledge all of the women who followed and how collectively so many gave generously of their time that has us where we are today. So thank you very much indeed.
Mary, you're obviously buying the pints. Thank you so much. And the idea that we constantly battle for reform, and we will carry on with the battle. And as I said, with people like you, it makes it easier. I'd like to ask Niamh Brannock to speak now. You will all know Niamh very well indeed. A very hard-working member of Dunleary Rathdown County Council. But of course, I suppose the woman who's remembered really for having been made a minister on her first day in the Dáil, and instead of perhaps running to hide, Niamh just took the opportunity and, was an outstanding minister, but has obviously also, as the first woman chair of the Labour Party, also has made enormous contributions in lots of different ways, and has always retained such an enormous sense of humour and warmth and commitment to her work and to Labour women. Thanks, Niamh.
Thank you, Susan. If you can't laugh at yourselves, there are enough people out there to laugh at you. I actually have taken the trouble to write this down because I've got to the age now where people are coming back and they're telling me about my life. And it isn't my life. It's not my idea of my life. So just recently, actually the first piece I did was a story about Michael D. Higgins. The next one on the list is my bits of Bertie, but I haven't got that written yet. And this I had started, and I called it From High Heels to Canvas Boots. Now, I'm in flat shoes, but actually I don't think it was all the canvassing. I think age catches up with the arches. Do you remember those things? The arches of your feet. So I'm just going to take the opportunity, just putting this on a record here, so that when people afterwards say, do you remember your one from Dunleary? Wait till I tell you. At least I'll have told you first. So if you bear with me, and it's only at 2 pages. My story starts with Mary Friel. She was there in her element addressing the mainly twin-setted audience of a thing called the Women's Political Association on the finer points of the Labour's equality document when she snared a new member, and that was me, and that was in the mid-70s. So she was about her work then. I, of course, didn't realise that the Labour Women's National Council was way ahead of its Labour brothers on equality issues, and actually a decade would pass before the Labour head office allowed us to have our meetings in head office. Before they found places for women on the AC, which was the Administrative Council, and adopt the policies of our little brown book, and it's a nice little one, and I hope somebody has it somewhere, but it took really more than a decade for those policies which dealt with divorce and contraception and those social issues to become part of the Labour Party election manifestos. So as the 80s joined, Labour only had 3 women in Leinster House. In the Dáil we had Eileen Desmond, Dan Desmond's widow. In the Seanad we had Evelyn Owens, serving as its first woman Cathaoirleach, and Mary Robinson, who, although she was elected to the Senate on the Labour panel, on the Trinity panel, she took the Labour whip. I remember first meeting the maleness of the Labour Party when Jean Tansey, who was then chair of the Women's Council, during the time when referendum was following referendum, she sought out a meeting with the PLP to warn them that actually supporting campaigns that were for life and against divorce and more divorce could badly affect the lives of women. And that was when I really realised how important it was to even have only one woman voice at the PLP, and that was Eileen Desmond's presence on those days. And I don't think the Labour Party disgraced themselves during those referendums, but it was very hard work keeping an eye on what the men were up to. The women citizens of this great republic, and Mary Free listed them, I think I've just 3 here, had gained the right to serve on juries. We had only been allowed to jump the bar. And the one that really got me, we were actually allowed to collect our children's allowance without getting their father's permission. That's just hard to imagine, but that's what it was like then. The idea of a future when contraception would be available, maternity leave, which was unknown then, and divorce, and all that would, within a decade, become part of the Labour Party's electoral message. That really was a dream too far, and I mean, we just never, I think Gay was still living happily ever after. I mean, there are whole areas of social life that were never mentioned, even in the Women's Council. Now, at that stage, it was quite acceptable for Michael D. Higgins to be the feminist voice of the party, and we were very proud of him. But also it was acceptable that only the male members of the International Affairs Committee would represent the Labour women at all the overseas meetings. Now, we weren't too happy about that. Jean Tansey was followed by Mary Woods, who was appointed by Barry Desmond to work as an advisor, and then I became the chair of the Women's Council. And I'll deviate just to say I found it very daunting, the idea of formulating policy and being up there. And then I realised that what really was driving me, and it was really from Mary Friel, I think, I just wanted to take the message. I promised, I think, not to invent one new bit of policy unless and until we had the contents of our equality document out in the public arena. So that was the task I set myself when, and I was reluctant, I just thought it was such a huge position to be the chair of the Women's Council that really I just wasn't, I wasn't good enough for it. And then I just said, well, I'll be the messenger. And it was that role of being the messenger on our policy that actually allowed me accept it and then move it forward really into the public arena. Now, we were twinned to the Socialist International Women, and that was important. We were being funded by the Socialist group in the European Parliament because not only didn't we have any MEPs at the European Parliament, but the Socialist group in the European Parliament missed us and actually decided to be part of a training and education programme. And of course, because it was coming from Europe, even head office had to do, the gender bit. So what were you spending on women? And then we actually got to spend the money. We hosted many public meetings, all with the creche. We produced more policy leaflets. So we took our policy and put it in to leaflets with pictures. We had an argument once when they sent in a photographer to take a photograph of a meeting, and Ita Kavanagh was smoking. We all were smokers, but she was having her, I'm smoking in this. And we actually had the argument saying we didn't really think we should have a leaflet with women smoking. And that was a very highfalutin argument that we had. But actually, the non-smoking message won, and the rest of us all put our cigarettes in our handbags. So we produced leaflets. We wrote many letters to Sir in the Irish Times. We didn't think there would ever be a madam there. And we took every opportunity to get onto the airwaves. Marion Finucane at that stage was... she was in RT, and then she went to run a sort of McGill edition for women, a magazine called Status, and then went back because the women's movement was keeping pages in newspapers running, and the Voice of Women was something that was actually selling newspapers and attracting women listeners for advertisements in the radio. And so it wasn't that difficult to find the places we should be, but it was quite difficult to find that we were the people they would ask. And at the last election, and there were 3 elections, one after the other in the 80s, we actually were back in the Dáil, and we had no woman at all on the Labour benches. Eileen Desmond had left to go to Europe, Evelyn Owens had left when she retired, and Mary Robinson had left the Labour Party, full stop. So having done all this work, we were finding it so hard to grow, and I always think of it in terms of growing the roots. We had nurtured it, we had invested in it, we had become respectable with it, and still when the last election happened, that's what we were looking at. And I think this is where Joan referred to Dick Spring saying, stop going on about it, I can't get women to run. But, we were now just at the end of the 80s. Back in 1985, because I'm trying to think, what did we hang it on and how did the 90s turn out so well for us? Back in 1985, the United Nations announced a decade for women, and that was launched in Nairobi. Now, we weren't there. We tried to get there, but Neela Fennell wouldn't take us. But we were watching what was happening. And in an imaginative move, and I think this is really worth saying, long before the calls to hear the 99%, the Council for the Status of Women, under Frances Fitzgerald, who's now the Minister for Children, and a great woman called Caroline Camley, the two of them organised a women's forum in the RDS to hear the voices and the opinions of women on this adopted UN Charter. They even sold contraception. They did there, and that was illegal, and it was daring, and we all went home with these handbags and things. Because we had to make the point, everybody had to spend money at these stalls. That was the one that took my imagination. So I led the active women into the public fray. Designed by Liz Allman, we now had our own letterhead. We identified ourselves with wearing roses in our lapels. Our literature was superbly designed, and we were actually very well heard at that. There were workshops and there was a place to put people into the different areas. So we continued the work, and one little story I do tell here, in an effort to keep making noise, we actually once gate crashed to do in the Mount Street headquarters of the Council for the Status of Women, and we arrived in with a bunch of roses. But we were actually very quickly upstaged by Liz McManus coming behind with a delegation from the Workers' Party demanding she got an audience too. So that kind of gives you a flavour of where there was some of this energy being dissipated. Now, we did have our internecine moments because it was the 80s. But time's a great healer. And by the end of that decade, head office was actually allowing us meet in its premises. And that had become important because we'd been thrown out by Lil. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of Lil, but I thought Lil was a woman who lived in a shop in Dame Street. And after we were thrown out, it turned out it wasn't a woman who lived in a shop in Dame Street. It was the liaison of Irish lesbians. And they had actually given us a room to have our meetings in. But when we insisted that Michael D. Higgins would be our guest speaker at the AGM, unfortunately, under the terms and conditions of taking a room, we actually didn't have anywhere to meet. Now, we ended up in Trinity and we moved around a bit, and finally we got in to head office. For inside head office, and here there was a year that Ethna Fitzgerald was in the chair, we successfully started to plot. And I don't know whether you have to get to look like a man to win in this, but you actually have to plot. You have to realise that what you do now is going to have, Frank Tusky was quite good at this, that then that would happen and this would happen, and you know that would happen. And I don't think women think like that at all. I think we put our best and give our most, and I don't say you hope things will work out, but you've done your best. But actually we decided, no, we better put our plotting hats on. And it was really that to get places on the AC, to become main players in the council. And that was even interesting, because when we finally got the motion on the agenda, down at annual conference, one of the most energetic speakers against it was actually one of our own executive members, and Jean Tansey and I were sort of left looking at each other in the front row. And a front row of a conference that sounds out for me was, I think the only other woman I noticed speaking was Jo Walsh. I'd never seen a woman speak at an annual conference. The total backdrop were all men, and the front rows were filled with the delegations from the trade unions, all men. So that to get your voice, it really was quite unusual that we would even look to talk to a collection like that. But anyway, with we got our reserve places. We began to make a lot of sounds on the Administrative Council. I did go forward and contested the Vice Chair twice and won the second time and went on then to win the Chair of the party. I think it was 1990. There's few figures in this because chronologically it wouldn't be my great strength. But anyway, at the end of that time, and then I made the Chair of the party, and that was a huge thing to have achieved because we were the first political party ever to elect to the chairperson of their party a woman, and we really did bang the drums. And to give the Labour women and men their due, they did a lot of banging of the drum on that. So Labour women then moved to address the need for gender quotas. We were lucky that among our membership we had Yvonne Galligan, and Yvonne Galligan is now the National Authority on Quotas, but way back before she went to Belfast, she was still a member in South East. She put the issue on the Labour Party agenda, and it has taken Ivana nearly 20 years for it to go on the national agenda, but sometimes it does take that long, and that's where it is. Also on our executive we had Nora O'Neill, who is a retired civil servant from the Department of Labour, and she drew our attention to the need to review the equal status legislation. Nora, who is probably the only member in the Labour Party who had a kind word to say about Michael O'Leary, but she had been one of his working civil servants. Now Michael had jumped ship to Fine Gael. So actually at one stage they even took his photograph off the wall in head office, as if you could rewrite your own history. But Nora was very conscious of the need to have a body of legislative work ready to be in place when, because she never had any doubt, when we would be in government. So the Equality Acts of the 90s were actually rooted in that work. So when Mervyn Taylor became Ireland's First Minister for Equality and Law Reform, the legislation he introduced was actually now a much extended and much amended piece, but it was actually the work that had begun with Nora with the Women's Council in the end of the 80s. So we'd come a long way. We had our national agenda, and one of the things that I think was very important to us, we also hosted a lot of international women, and some of it did appear, I'm sure, to some of the male members. Well, the first guest was Kate Millett, the American lesbian feminist author of Sexual Politics, and Brendan Halligan was the only man in the Labour Party that realised what we were up to, and nobody else had a clue. We could actually fill the auditorium in Liberty Hall with women coming from all parts of Ireland to hear this woman speak. But we did it, and it was only on the last day we had a phone call from Brendan Halligan. Is this really her? So he said yes, it really was her, and it was a great success. We had people like Yvette Roudy, who was the first woman minister ever appointed to a parliament. She was the French Minister for Women. We wined and we dined Madame Papandreou, mother of George. Now, she was something else because she was actually an American who had married the father, and they were now living in Sweden. And she was part of the international group that was actually prepared to come and visit us and help us and challenge us. Now, she was, I would think, she wasn't the easiest guest, but again, the men of the party suddenly realised the importance of the people who were accepting our invitations. We had Anita Gradin, who was the Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs, who went on to be a commissioner afterwards. We had many, many socialist MEPs, and some of them arrived in glorious purple. And I hadn't a clue that that was actually quite significant, but they were a great group of women, and they really threw everything they had into coming to poor old Ireland, who hadn't a woman in the Dáil, or the ones that were there weren't ours. And really, they are just come out of a social democratic background that expected women to be up on the list system, that expected women to be there. And even in the Norwegian women, they actually had gone for gender quotas, not just on electoral lists, but actually on the appointment of women to their cabinet. So, where do you start to thank people? But those visitors certainly broadened our minds. They raised the horizon of our expectation. I mean, these people, I went to a workshop in Bonn about helping women be elected, and they were coming from Eastern Europe, and it was really before Yugoslavia broke up, so it was the early days, and then there were terrible days. But I was left in charge of a workshop. I said, but we don't have a woman, and will I get elected? They had such confidence that things were changing, that they were actually quite prepared to say, now I think an English-speaking organiser was a plus, but they were quite prepared to give the places to the Irish women who attended on those delegations. And then to the people who were there with us, and I think in a way I tried to put the names down in a way they'd rhyme, because there are loads of names not in it. But I said to Alice and Ailish and Liz, Ita, Sheila, and Lillian, Peggy, Jean and Joan and Etna, Alicia, who's here, and the Mary, some of them here, Fanula, who was here, Anita and Marion in head office, and all those women who really didn't give up hope, and they helped so much in those decades. And I think too, and I think it was Mary or was it Joan who mentioned Dick Spring, I think we do have to thank Dick Spring, because he actually saw a role for women in elected politics. We didn't have a lot in common with him. We had more in common with his mother. But he actually saw we had something to bring to a team as he was planning to take the Labour Party centre stage. And the next move he made, and the one he made in the 90s, was when he nominated a woman for president. Thank you.
Well, that really was and still is Niamh Branagh. Thank you so much. I think it's very difficult when the clock is ticking against us, but I get the feeling that everybody's thoroughly enjoying hearing the stories and I suppose realising the enormous achievements that have occurred. It's very easy to forget sometimes what has actually, where we came from and what we have achieved. So thank you to Niamh particularly for telling us that it was Mary that ensnared you. So I'm hoping that our next speaker, Emer Costello, Councillor Emer Costello, is going to tell us who ensnared her.